Welcome to Dieu Han RV. Today's story reveals the quiet pain inside a man who always loved silently. Then, though gentle and kind, carries storms within. On the outside, he's steady, but inside, his heart still echoes with wounds life never healed. And when someone from his past suddenly returns, everything he thought was buried rises again. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. We're grateful to have you with us today. Stories like this one remind us how the quietest hearts often carry the loudest battles. And Than's story may be the one you relate to more than you expect. Than's love for Dieu Han isn't loud. It shows in the meals he cooks, the pots he clears, the silence he respects. He never forces anything, never asks for more than she can give. But when this old ghost walks back into his life, Than's carefully built walls begin to shake. It was someone Than had once called a brother, a man who had shared years of friendship, laughter, and quiet loyalty. But something had torn them apart long ago, a betrayal. A truth too heavy to hold. Seeing him again brought back everything Than tried to bury. His breath caught in his chest. Than stood frozen. Memories clashed inside him, late night talks, trust once unshakable, then a silence that never healed. This wasn't just an old friend. This was the man who once knew his soul. But time had turned that closeness into distance. And now they stood as strangers wearing familiar faces. He wanted to speak, but the weight in his chest held him back. So many questions remained unspoken. Was it regret in the man's eyes, or something else entirely? Then felt his own heart hesitate. Could forgiveness exist after years of silence? Could a bond once shattered be mended? This story is far from over. What happened between these two men? And how will this reunion affect Than's path? And maybe even Dieu Han's life? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dieu Han RV, and hit the bell so you never miss what happens next. Their past is only beginning to resurface. The moment Than saw his face, time cracked open. That familiar jawline, the slight limp in his walk, the way he avoided eye contact, it all came rushing back. His mind didn't need a second to recognize him. It was Lam, the man he once trusted with everything, the one who vanished like a ghost. Than felt the blood drain from his face. The last time they were together, they had just lost everything in a failed investment. What little money was left, Lam had promised to hold and protect. But he never came back. Than waited for days, then weeks, until hope turned into betrayal. He remembered the empty room, the unanswered calls, the lies Lam left behind. No warning, no apology, just silence. Than had blamed himself for trusting too easily. For years, he rebuilt his life piece by piece, carrying shame like a second skin. And now, that same ghost stood breathing before him. Than's fists clenched without him realizing. Lam didn't look ashamed. If anything, he looked older, calmer, like someone who had moved on. But Than hadn't. The wounds hadn't closed. Not even close. Seeing Lam was like touching a scar that still burned beneath the skin. He wanted to scream, to ask why he left, why he stole, why he never even tried to explain. But his voice failed him. The anger didn't come out in shouts. It settled like poison in his throat, thick and burning, making it hard to even breathe. Lam looked at him with unreadable eyes. Was it guilt, pity, or just indifference? Than couldn't tell. That mystery only deepened the rage. If Lam had come to apologize, why now? Why after all this time? If not, then what the hell was he doing here? Memories hit him in waves. How they once dreamed of building a business together, joked about old age, shared late dinners when money was tight. Than had trusted Lam like a brother. And Lam had walked away without looking back. Now, that ghost wanted what? Redemption. Than didn't know whether to hit him or walk away. His hands shook. His chest burned. Years of buried pain had found a way to rise, ugly and raw. And Lam just stood there, not saying a word. That silence, once so familiar, was now unbearable. Some wounds don't need time, they need answers. Than didn't want revenge, he just needed to know why. Why their bond wasn't enough to keep Lam from running. Why trust had meant so little. Without those answers, Than knew he'd never truly be free. His mouth opened, but the words never formed. Just then, Dieu Han called from behind him, then blinked, reality snapping back into place. This wasn't just his pain now. He had people who cared. A place that healed. But this ghost still demanded closure. He turned to leave, not because he was ready, but because he couldn't let the past rob him again. As he walked away, he could still feel Lamb's eyes on his back. Maybe the answers would come later. For now, Then chose to walk toward the life he had rebuilt. Some ghosts don't disappear. They wait. Lamb had returned, but then wasn't the same boy anymore. He had scars now, yes, but also strength. Whether forgiveness would ever come remained unknown. But then had faced the past, and that, for now, was enough. There was a time when Than, Lamb, and a girl were inseparable. The trio had shared not only business dreams but youthful adventures. They laughed through rainy afternoons, argued over silly things, and leaned on each other when life struck hard. She had a smile that could ease tension instantly. Than recalled the way Lamb always looked at her, something deeper hiding in his gaze. Than used to think it was all in his head, that Lamb and the girl were just close friends, like the three of them all were. But there had been moments too many moments. When Lamb's presence around her shifted, he became quieter, more intense. Then never asked. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he feared the answer would change everything. It was in the small cafe near the riverside where the truth began to crack through. One evening, Lamb had left early, and she, uncharacteristically quiet, stared into her cup for minutes. Then remembered her sigh, long, conflicted, like she was carrying something she couldn't say out loud, something buried beneath years of friendship. Later that night, she confessed she felt something for Lamb, but she wasn't sure if it was mutual. Then listened in silence, torn between protecting the friendship and the sting in his own chest. He had feelings for her too, but he had buried them for the sake of their trio. That night, something shifted forever. They never talked about it again. Lamb never mentioned her in that way, but things changed. The trio began to meet less. The laughter faded. When Lamb proposed their big investment plan, Than had agreed partly to salvage what was left of their bond. He thought building something together might bring them back, but instead of fixing things, it broke them. The plan failed, the money disappeared, and so did Lamb. She tried to stay in touch at first, but eventually even she fell silent. Than was left with unanswered calls and a grief too complex to explain. It wasn't just about money. It was about losing two people at once. Memories of her were tangled with the betrayal. Her voice, her laughter, even the way she looked at Lamb. Then sometimes wondered if she knew what Lamb had planned, if she had warned him. Would it have changed anything? The past held too many what-ifs and not enough closure. Years passed, and Than forced himself to forget. He built new routines, surrounded himself with new people. But every now and then, a certain laugh or a familiar perfume would bring her rushing back into his mind. It was never just Lamb he lost. It was the whole world they once shared. Seeing Lamb again reopened a door Than had sealed shut, and with it came ghosts he wasn't ready to face. What if Lamb brought news about her? What if she had sent him? The thought made his heart race. Part of him hoped, the other part feared more pain. He hated that he still cared, that after all this time, the thought of her could make his chest tighten. Then wasn't sure if it was love, nostalgia, or just unfinished feelings. But he knew one thing for certain. Lamb held answers, and Than wasn't sure if he was ready to hear them. He watched Lamb closely, trying to read between the lines of his face. There were traces of guilt there, maybe even sorrow, but no mention of her. Then waited. Maybe Lamb was waiting too. And sure of whether to open that old wound, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy. Than almost asked. Her name was on the tip of his tongue, but his pride held him back. He didn't want to give Lamb the satisfaction of knowing how deep the wound ran. Not yet. The past had already stolen too much. Than wasn't ready to let it take his dignity too. As they stood near the old streetlight outside Dieu Han's gate, a breeze passed between them like a memory. It was in this same spot they had once laughed with her, holding cups of cheap iced coffee, dreaming aloud under the stars. That night had felt endless. Now, it felt like another life. Lamb finally spoke, his voice low. "I never meant to leave like that," he said, then said nothing. Lamb didn't continue. Maybe he expected forgiveness. Maybe he didn't. But that one sentence shattered years of silence. Than's jaw tightened. He wanted more than an apology. He wanted the truth. Than took a breath but still said nothing. The pain in his eyes was answer enough. Lam looked away, clearly wounded by the silence. But Than could not forget how Lam had walked away when everything was falling apart. He needed more than a few words to rebuild what was lost. I thought about writing to you, Lam admitted quietly, trying to meet Than's gaze. But I didn't know what to say. I was ashamed. The words hung heavy in the air. Than clenched his fists. He wanted to shout, to ask why, but all he could do was swallow the anger burning inside. You left when I needed you the most. Than finally said, voice tight with pain. I didn't even get a goodbye. Lam winced. I know. He whispered, I'm sorry. But sorry couldn't fix the nights Than spent alone, the trust that shattered, or the friendship that had turned into ashes. Don't expect things to go back to how they were. Than added, eyes fixed on the ground. Lam gave a slow nod. I just wanted to say it, that I regret it, all of it. Then looked at him then. The anger still simmering, but also the pain of someone who once called him brother. They stood in silence again. This time, it was different. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of two men standing on the edge of something fragile. Forgiveness wasn't easy. Trust was even harder, but for now, they both knew nothing would be the same again. What would you do if a friend who once betrayed you came back, asking for forgiveness? Can time really heal a wound that deep? Or do some scars never fade? Lam's return stirred up the past. But Than's silence speaks louder than words. Would you give that friend another chance? Let us know what you would do in his place. Thank you for watching this emotional chapter of Dieu Han RV. If you felt moved by Than's story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss what happens next. Big secrets are still waiting to be uncovered. Your support means the world to us.